Episode 43, The Trail of Tears. Hey y'all, I'm Heather, and this is Poison Appalachia, the dark side of Appalachia. As always, thank you for listening. Hope you enjoyed last week's episode on the diseases of Appalachia. It was a little different than usual, but I had fun researching it, and I hope you enjoyed listening to it. Today's subject is something I've been wanting to talk about since the beginning of this podcast, the Trail of Tears. I've kind of put it off a bit because it's such an awful thing that our nation did to its indigenous peoples, and it kind of makes me mad and it makes me sad, but I do feel like we really need to discuss it, or I need to discuss it, and you need to listen. The Trail of Tears was the forced displacement of about 60,000 people of the 5 civilized tribes between 1830 and 1850, and the additional thousands of Native Americans and their enslaved African Americans within that were ethnically cleansed by the United States government. Early in the 19th century, the United States felt threatened by England and Spain, who held land in the western continent. At the same time, American settlers clamored for more land. Thomas Jefferson proposed the creation of a buffer zone between U.S. and European holdings to be inhabited by Eastern American Indians. This plan would allow for American expansion westward from the original colonies to the Mississippi River. The roots of forced relocation lay in greed. The British Proclamation of 1763 designated the region between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River as Indian Territory. After Native American grievances had resulted in the start of Pontiac's War in 1763-64, British authorities determined to subdue intercolonial rivalries and abuses by dealing with Native American problems as a whole. To that end, the proclamation organized new British territories in America, the provinces of Quebec, East and West Florida, and Grenada in the Windward Islands, and as a vast British-administered Native American reservation west of the Appalachians, from south of the Hudson Bay to north of the Floridas. It forbade settlement of Native American territory, ordered those settlers already there to withdraw, and strictly limited future settlement. For the first time in the history of the European colonization in the New World, the proclamation formalized the concept of Native American land titles, prohibiting issuance of patents to any land claimed by a tribe unless the Native American title had first been extinguished by purchase or treaty. Although not intended to alter Western boundaries, the proclamation was nevertheless offensive to the colonies as undue interference in their affairs. Treaties following Pontiac's War drew a line of settlement more acceptable to colonial settlers, which was the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, which I mentioned in a couple episodes. I think it was in the Curse of the Mothman and the Shawnee Lake episode. But anyways, so the continued westward movement of pioneers and the settlers' disregard of the proclamation's provisions evoked decades of continued Native American warfare throughout this area. The addition of the balance of the territory north of the Ohio River to Quebec in 1774 further exacerbated colonial conflict with Britain. Although that region was to be protected for the exclusive use of indigenous peoples, large numbers of Euro-American land speculators and settlers soon entered. For the most part, the British and later U.S. governments ignored these acts of trespass. We often think of the Trail of Tears just being the Cherokee Nation, or maybe that's just me, but that's really, the Cherokee is what I hear about the most in dealing with the Trail of Tears. But it was, as I mentioned earlier, the forcing of the, as they called it, the 5 civilized tribes. These tribes were members of the Cherokee, Muskogee, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw nations. The descriptor civilized, historically used to obscure the cultural imperialism of white settlers, is seldom used nowadays because the derogatory implication is that the other native tribes were uncivilized. So consequently, the grouping of these nations is now referred to just as the 5 tribes, or simply 5 tribes. I'd like to go into each nation a little bit. The Muskogee were in Alabama. They're also known as the Creek. So if you heard of Creek Nation or Creek Indians, they're the Muskogee. The Muskogee Nation website says, before the removal treaty of 1832, the Muskogee people inhabited most of what is now Alabama. The Muskogee Nation was comprised of tribal towns, including the tribal town site Hickory Ground Tribal Town. Hickory Ground is of major importance in the history of the Muskogee Nation. Hickory Ground is of major importance in the history of the Muskogee Nation, Hickory Ground Tribal Town, and the United States. Hickory Ground, this is hard to say, Hickory Ground was critical to the very formation of the United States. When European nations questioned the sovereignty of the newly born United States, President George Washington lent legitimacy to the nascent country by signing treaties with the Indian nations, including the Muskogee Nation, whose sovereignty had previously been affirmed through treaties with Spain and England. Thus, in 1790, nearly 2 centuries before the Porch was recognized as a tribe, President George Washington executed a treaty with the Muscogee Nation. In the early 19th century, the United States Indian policy focused on the removal of the Muscogee and the other southeastern tribes to the areas beyond the Mississippi River. In the Removal Treaty of 1832, Muscogee leadership exchanged the last of their cherished Muscogee ancestral homelands for new lands in the Indian Territory, which is now Oklahoma. Many of the lower Muscogee had settled in the new homeland after the Treaty of Washington in 1827, but for the majority of Muscogee people in the process of severing ties to the land they felt so much a part of, it proved impossible. The U.S. Army enforced the removal of more than 20,000 Muscogee to Indian Territory in 1836 and 1837. Next is the Seminole. The Seminole are Native American people who developed in Florida in the 18th century. Today they live in Oklahoma and Florida and comprise 3 federally recognized tribes: the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma, Seminole Tribe of Florida, and the Miccosukee Tribe of Indians of Florida, as well as independent groups. The Seminole people emerged as a process of ethnogenesis from various Native American groups who settled in Spanish Florida beginning in the early 1700s. Most significantly, northern Muscogee Creeks from what are now Georgia and Alabama. Seminole history begins with bands of Creek Indians from Georgia and Alabama who migrated to Florida in the 1700s. Conflicts with Europeans and other tribes caused them to seek new lands to live in peace. Groups of lower Creeks moved to Florida to get away from the dominance of upper Creeks. Some Creeks were searching for rich new fields to plant corn, beans, and other crops. For a while, Spain even encouraged these migrations to help provide a buffer between Florida and the British colonies. The 1770s is when Florida Indians collectively became known as the Seminole, a name meaning wild people or runaway. In addition to Creeks, Seminoles included Yukees, Yamasas, and a few Aboriginal remnants. The population also increased with runaway slaves who found a refuge among the Indians. In some places I read that they were known as Black Seminoles. Run-ins with white settlers were becoming more regular by the turn of the century. Settlers wanted Indian land and their former slaves back. In 1817, these conflicts escalated into the first of 3 wars against the United States. Future U.S. President Andrew Jackson invaded then Spanish Florida, attacked several key locations, and pushed the Seminole further south into Florida. Under colonist pressure, the U.S. government made the 1823 Treaty of Camp Moultrie with the Seminoles, seizing 24 million acres in northern Florida. They offered the Seminoles a much smaller reservation in the Everglades of about 100,000 acres. Our government's history is to send the Native Americans to the worst places where they have no use of that land, until they do have use of the land, and then they send them to another place even worse than the one before. After passage of the Indian Removal Act in 1830, the U.S. government attempted to relocate Seminoles to Oklahoma, causing yet another war, the Second Seminole War. In 1832, the U.S. government signed the Treaty of Payne's Landing with few of the Seminole chiefs. They promised lands west of the Mississippi if the chiefs agreed to leave Florida voluntarily with their people. The Seminoles who remained prepared for war. White colonists continued to press for their removal. After defeating the U.S. in early battles of the Second Seminole War, Seminole leader Osceola was captured by the United States in October 20th, 1837, when U.S. troops said they wanted a truce to talk peace. Osceola was arrested in a breach of honor when he came under a flag of truce to negotiations with the U.S. in 1837. He died in jail less than a year later. He was decapitated, his body buried without his head. Next are the Chickasaw. The Chickasaw are an indigenous people of the southeastern woodlands of the United States. Their traditional territory was in northern Mississippi, northwestern and northern Alabama, western Tennessee, and southwestern Kentucky. Their language is classified as a member of the Muskegon language family. In the present day, they are organized as the federally recognized Chickasaw Nation. Chickasaw people have a migration story in which they moved from the land west of the Mississippi River to reach present-day northeast Mississippi, northwest Alabama, and into Lawrence County, Tennessee. They had interaction with the French, English, and Spanish colonists during the colonial period. Due to settlers encroaching into Chickasaw territory, the United States constructed Fort Hampton in 1810 in present-day Limestone County, Alabama. The fort was designed to keep settlers out of the Chickasaw territory and was one of the few forts constructed in the United States to protect Native American land. Resisting European American settlers encroaching into their own territory, they were forced by the U.S. government to sell their traditional lands in the 1832 Treaty of Pontotoc Creek and move to Indian Territory during the era of the Indian removal in the 1830s. In 1832, after the state of Mississippi declared its jurisdiction over the Chickasaw Indians, outlining tribal self-governance, Chickasaw chiefs assembled to Nation Council House on October 20th, 1832, and signed the Treaty of Pontotoc Creek, ceding their remaining Mississippi territory to the U.S. and agreeing to find land and relocate west of the Mississippi River. Between 1832 and 1837, the Chickasaw would make further negotiations and arrangements for their removal. Unlike other tribes who received land grants in exchange for ceding territory, the Chickasaw held out for financial compensation. They were to receive $3 million from the United States for their lands east of the Mississippi. In 1836, after a bitter 5-year debate within the tribe, the Chickasaw had reached an agreement to purchase land in Indian Territory from the previously removed Choctaw. They paid the Choctaw $530,000 for the westernmost part of their land. The first group of Chickasaw moved in 1837. The Chickasaw gathered at Memphis, Tennessee on July 4th, 1837 with all of their portable assets, belongings, livestock, and enslaved African Americans. 3,001 Chickasaw crossed the Mississippi River following routes established by the Choctaw and the Creek. During the journey, often referred to as the Trail of Tears, more than 500 Chickasaw died of dysentery and smallpox. The Choctaw are a Native American people originally based in the southeastern woodlands in what is now Mississippi and Alabama. The Choctaw language is a Western Muskegon language. The Choctaw coalesced as people in the 16th century and had developed at least 3 distinct political and geographical divisions prior to European contact. The Western Okla Falaya, which is a Long people, the Eastern Okla Tanap people on the other side, and the Southern Okla Hanali, 6 townspeople. Eventually, these different groups would create distinct, independent alliances with nearby European powers. Most Choctaw allied with Americans during the American Revolution, War of 1812, and the Red Stick War, most notably at the Battle of New Orleans. European Americans considered the Choctaw to be one of the 5 civilized tribes of the Southeast. The Choctaw and the United States agreed to a total of 9 treaties. By the last 3, the U.S. gained vast land cessions in the Southeast. As part of the Indian removal, despite not having waged war against the United States, the majority of Choctaw were forcibly relocated to Indian Territory from 1831 to 1833. Choctaw who chose to stay in the state of Mississippi were considered state and U.S. citizens, and they were one of the first major non-European ethnic groups to be granted citizenship. Article 14 in the 1830 treaty with Choctaw stated that Choctaws may wish to become citizens of the United States under the 14th article of the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek on all of the combined lands which were consolidated under Article 1 from all previous treaties between the United States and the Choctaw. The last group I want to talk about are the Cherokee people. The Cherokee people are one of the indigenous peoples of the southeastern woodlands of the United States. Prior to the 18th century, they were concentrated in their homelands and towns along rivers and valleys of what is now southwestern North Carolina, southeastern Tennessee, southwestern Virginia, edges of western South Carolina, and northern Georgia, and northeastern Alabama, consisting of around 40,000 square miles. The Cherokee allied with the U.S. against the nativist and pro-British Red Stick faction of the Upper Creek and the Creek War during the War of 1812. Cherokee warriors led by Major Ridge played a major role in General Andrew Jackson's victory at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. Major Ridge moved his family to Rome, Georgia, where he built a substantial house, developed a large plantation, and ran a ferry on the Oostahola River. Although he never learned English, he sent his son and nephews to New England to be educated in mission schools. His interpreter and protege, Chief John Ross, the descendant of several generations of Cherokee women and Scots fur traders, built a plantation and operated a trading firm and a ferry at Ross's Landing, Chattanooga, Tennessee. During this period, divisions arose between the cultured elite and the great majority of Cherokee who clung to traditional ways of life. Before the final removal of the present-day Oklahoma, many Cherokees relocated to present-day Arkansas, Missouri, and Texas. Between 1775 and 1786, the Cherokee, along with people of the other nations such as the Choctaw and Chickasaw, began voluntarily settling along the Arkansas and Red Rivers. In 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, authorizing the forcible relocation of American Indians east of the Mississippi to new Indian Territory. Jackson claimed the removal policy was an effort to prevent the Cherokee from facing extinction as a nation, which he considered the fate that the Mohegan, the Narragansett, and the Delaware had suffered. There is, however, ample evidence that the Cherokees were adapting to modern farming techniques. A modern analysis shows that the area in general in a state of economic surplus and could have accommodated both the Cherokee and the new settlers. So that's a brief, or not so brief with me, description of the 5 tribes. I keep talking about the Indian Removal Act, but I wanted to start a little bit further than that in the history leading up to this. President George Washington and Henry Knox, the first Secretary of War, implemented a policy of cultural transformation in relation to Native Americans. The Cherokee and Choctaw tended in turn to adopt and appropriate certain cultural aspects of the Federation of Colonies. George Washington's 6-point plan, including regulating the buying of Indian lands, promoting commerce with the Indians, promoting experiments to civilize or improve Indian society, authorizing presidential authority to bestow presents on the tribes, and to punish those who violated the Indian rights. Native peoples were encouraged to adopt European customs. First, they were forced to convert to Christianity and abandon traditional religious practices. They were also required to learn and speak and read in English, although there was interest in creating and writing a printing system for new native languages, especially Cherokee, exemplified by Sequoyah's Cherokee syllabary, which I mentioned on an episode about Sequoyah. The Native Americans had also adopted settler values such as monogamous marriage and abandonment of non-marital sex. Finally, they had to accept the concept of individual ownership of land and other property, including in some instances African people as slaves. Many Cherokee people adopted all or some of these practices. So everyone's getting along fairly well. The Native Americans and the U.S. governments have a compromise stating that their land is set aside, that we will not settle in, and they have agreed to live by our laws and way of life. But following the establishment of independence following the American Revolutionary War, Americans pushed into the interior, into the Deep South areas that were still largely dominated by Native Americans. The invention of the cotton gin made cultivation of short, stable cotton profitable in the interior, and settlers encroached on Native American lands in the Upper South, including western Georgia and the future states of Alabama, Louisiana, and Mississippi. They demanded the chance to cultivate these lands for agriculture. Colonializers gonna colonialize, you know. Armed conflicts occurred between some of the tribes and the settlers, who kept pushing west and acquired additional territories through negotiated treaties with Europe and European colonial powers, and sometimes by force. Then along came President Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was the 7th president of the United States from 1829 to 1837. Before his presidency, he rose to fame as a general in the U.S. Army and served in both houses of the U.S. Congress. Andrew Jackson sought to renew a policy of political and military action for the removal of natives from these lands and worked towards enacting a law for Indian removal in 1829. In his 1829 State of the Union address, Jackson called for Indian removal. Coincidentally, or maybe not so coincidentally, in 1829, a gold rush occurred on Cherokee land in Georgia. Vast amounts of wealth were at stake. At their peak, Georgia mines produced approximately 300 ounces of gold a day. Land speculators soon demanded that the U.S. Congress devolve to the states the control of all real property owned by tribes and their members. That position was supported by Andrew Jackson, who himself was an avid speculator. The Indian Removal Act was put in place to annex native land and then transfer that ownership to southern states, especially Georgia. The act was passed in 1830, although dialogue had been ongoing since 1802 between Georgia and the federal government concerning the possibility of such an act. Ethan Davis states that the federal government had promised Georgia that it would extinguish Indian title within the state's borders by purchase as soon as such purchase could be made upon reasonable terms. As time passed, southern states began to speed up the expulsions by claiming that the deal between Georgia and the federal government was invalid and that the southern states could pass laws extinguishing Indian titles themselves. In response, the federal government passed the Indian Removal Act on May 28, 1830, in which President Jackson agreed to divide the United States territory west of the Mississippi River into districts for tribes to replace the land from which they were removed. Congress complied by passing the Indian Removal Act 1830. This act entitled the president to negotiate with eastern nations to effect their removal to tracts of land west of the Mississippi and provided some $500,000 for transportation and for compensation to native landowners. Jackson reiterated his support for the act in various messages to Congress, notably on Indian removal and a permanent habitation for the American Indians, which illuminated his political justifications for removal and described some of the outcomes he had expected would derive from the relocation process. The Indian Removal Act was controversial. Many Americans during this time favored its passage, but there was also significant opposition. Many Christian missionaries protested against it, some most notably missionary organizer Jeremiah Everts. In Congress, New Jersey Senator Theodore Frelinghuysen, Kentucky Senator Henry Clay, and Tennessee Congressman Davy Crockett spoke out against the legislation. The Removal Act passed only after a bitter debate in the Congress. Clay extensively campaigned against it on the National Republican Party ticket in 1832, the United States presidential election. Jackson viewed the demise of Native Americans as inevitable, pointing to the steady expansion of European-based lifestyles and the decimation of native nations in the U.S. northeastern region. He called his northern critics hypocrites, given that the North's history regarding native nations within their claimed territory. Jackson stated that the progress requires moving forward. The Removal Act paved the way for the forced expulsion of tens of thousands of American Indians from the Cherokee tribe in 1838-39 into the West, an event widely known as the Trail of Tears, a forced resettlement of the Indian population. This event has been characterized as genocide. The first removal treaty signed was the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek on September 27, 1830, in which Choctaw and Mississippi ceded land east of the river in exchange for payment and land in the West. Jackson chose to continue with Indian removal and negotiated the Treaty of New Echota on December 29, 1835, which granted the Cherokee 2 years to move Indian territory to modern-day Oklahoma. The Chickasaws and Choctaws had readily accepted and signed treaties with the U.S. government, while the Muskogee did so under coercion. The negotiation of the Treaty of the New Echota was largely encouraged by Jackson, and it was signed by a minority Cherokee political faction. The treaty party led by Cherokee leader Elias Boudinot. However, the treaty was opposed by most of the Cherokee people as it was not approved by Cherokee National Council, and it was not signed by Principal Chief John Ross. The Cherokee National Council submitted a petition signed by thousands of Cherokee citizens urging Congress to void the agreement in February 1836. Despite this opposition, the Senate ratified the treaty in March 1836, and the Treaty of New Echota thus became the legal basis for the Trail of Tears. Only a fraction of the Cherokees left voluntarily. The U.S. government, with assistance from state militias, forced most of the remaining Cherokees west in 1838. The Cherokee were temporarily remanded in camps in eastern Tennessee. In November, the Cherokee were broken into groups around 1,000 each and began the journey west. They endured heavy rains, snow, and freezing temperatures. When the Cherokee negotiated the Treaty of New Echota, they exchanged all their land east of the Mississippi for land in modern Oklahoma and a $5 million payment from the federal government. Many Cherokee felt betrayed, but that their leadership accepted the deal, and over 16,000 Cherokee signed a petition to prevent the passage of this, which I mentioned a minute ago. By the end of the decade, in 1840, tens of thousands of Cherokees and other Indian nations had been removed from their land east of the Mississippi River. The Creek, which is Muskogee, Choctaw, Seminole, and Chickasaw were also relocated under the Indian Removal Act of 1830. One Choctaw leader portrayed the removal as a trail of tears and deaths, a devastating event that removed most of the Indian populations from the southeastern United States from their traditional homelands. The Seminoles and other tribes did not leave peacefully, as they resisted the removal along with fugitive slaves. The Second Seminole War lasted from 1835 to 1842 and resulted in the government allowing them to remain in South Florida swampland. Only a small number remained, and around 3,000 were removed in the war. In the winter of 1838, the Cherokee began the 1,000-mile march with scant clothing and most on foot without shoes or moccasins. The march began in Red Clay, Tennessee, the location of the last eastern capital of the Cherokee Nation. Because of the diseases, Indians were not allowed to go into any towns or villages along the way. Many times this meant traveling much further to go around them. After crossing Tennessee and Kentucky, they arrived at the Ohio River across from Golconda in southern Illinois, about the 3rd of December 1838. Here, the starving Indians were charged $1 a head, equal to $29 today, to cross the river on Berry's Ferry, which typically charged 12 cents, equal to about $3 today to the white men. They were not allowed passage until the ferry had serviced all others wishing to cross and were forced to take shelter under Mantle Rock, a shelter bluff on the Kentucky side, until Berry had nothing better to do. Many died huddled together at Mantle Rock waiting to cross. Several Cherokee were murdered by locals. The Cherokee filed a lawsuit against the U.S. government through the courthouse in Vienna, suing the government for $35 a head, which is equal to about $1,000 today, to bury the murdered Cherokee. It eventually took almost 3 months to cross the 60 miles on land between the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. The trek through southern Illinois is where the Cherokee suffered most of their deaths. However, a few years before forced removal, some Cherokee who opted to leave their homes voluntarily chose a water-based route through the Tennessee, Ohio, and Mississippi rivers. It only took 21 days, but the Cherokee who were forcibly relocated were wary of water travel. In addition to a physical relocation, American Indian removal and the Trail of Tears had social and cultural effects, as Native Americans were forced to contemplate abandonment of their native land. To the Cherokees, life was part of the land. Every rock, every tree, every place had a spirit, and the spirit was central to the tribal lifeway. To many, the thought of loss of place was thought of loss of self, loss of Cherokee-ness, and loss of lifeway. This cultural shift is characterized by Gild Whitaker as environmental deprivation, a concept that relates to historical processes of land and resource disposition calculated to bring about the destruction of Indigenous Americans' lives and cultures. Environmental deprivation is, in this sense, refers to actions by settlers and settler governments that are designed to block Native people's access to life-giving and culture-affirming resources. The separation of American Indian people from their land led to the loss of cultural knowledge and practices, as described by scholar Rachel Robinson Green, who finds the legacy of 15th century European colonial domination led to the indigenous knowledge and perspectives being ignored and degraded by the vast majority of social, physical, biological, and art scientists and governments using colonial power to exploit indigenous resources. Indigenous culture and intellectual contribution to the environmental issues in the form of rich history, cultural customs, and practical wisdom regarding sustainable environment practices can be lost because of indigenous removal and the Trail of Tears, according to Green. There were some exceptions to removal. Approximately 100 Cherokees evaded the U.S. soldiers and lived on the land in Georgia and other states. These Cherokees, who lived on private, individually owned lands rather than community-owned tribal land, were not subject to removal. In North Carolina, about 400 Cherokees, sometimes referred to as the Oconaluftee Cherokee, due to their settlements down to the river of the same name, lived in the land in the Great Smoky Mountains owned by a white man named William Holland Thomas, who had been adopted by Cherokees as a boy, and they were thus not subject to removal. Added to this were some 200 Cherokee from the Nantahala area allowed to stay on the Qualla boundary. After assisting the U.S. Army in hunting down and capturing the family of the old prophet Solly, who was executed by firing squad, as were most of the family. These North Carolina Cherokee became the eastern band of the Cherokee Nation. In total, those relocated counted 15,000 Choctaw, 19,000 Muskogees, 4,600 Chickasaw, and 4,000 Seminole, and 16,000 Cherokee, but according to Indian Affairs reports from 1841, there were 25,911 Cherokees already removed to Indian Territory. There ended up being 17,000 deaths in total. Such an awful thing that we as Americans did to our native people. It makes me sad and it makes me mad. I guess I don't really have much more to say about it, except it was just an awful, awful thing. So that's about it for today's episode. Hope you enjoyed it. As always, thank you for listening. You can follow me on social media under Poison Appalachia. I'm on Instagram, Facebook, Threads, Lemonade, TikTok, Blue Sky, and YouTube. If you could, on the podcast platform you listen to, could you please like and rate me? And share me, please. Let everyone know about my podcast. Thanks. Have a great week.